When you're invited on a road trip with friends, you expect some laughs, good times, maybe a few hangovers. But what if the friend of a friend who invited you had rules? Strange rules. Rules that, if broken, could lead to something far worse than just a bad vacation. We didn't think much of it at first. We laughed, shrugged it off. But by the time we realized those rules were deadly serious, it was too late. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a weekend getaway with my girlfriend Lisa and a couple of her college friends. We'd been dating for a few months, and this trip was supposed to be a chance for me to get to know her friends better, to see if I could fit into her world. The plan was to drive up to a cabin in the mountains, spend a few days hiking, drinking, and just relaxing. Nothing complicated, nothing stressful. I wasn't particularly close to Lisa's friends, but they seemed like good people, easygoing, fun to be around. There was Dave, the life of the party, always ready with a joke and a bottle of whiskey. His girlfriend Sarah was quieter, more reserved, but she had a sharp wit that kept everyone on their toes. Then there was Matt, a friend of Dave's from high school. I'd only met him once before, and he was a bit of an oddball. Tall, lanky, with a nervous energy that made him seem constantly on edge. But he was all right.
Just one thing. There are a few rules we need to follow while we're up there,
Matt said as we were loading up the car. Lisa and I exchanged a look, both of us raising an eyebrow. Rules? For a cabin in the woods? It sounded ridiculous, but Matt seemed dead serious.
What kind of rules?
Dave asked, clearly amused. Matt hesitated, his eyes darting around as if he was checking to make sure no one else was listening.
They're just precautions. Things my family has always done when we stay at the cabin. It's important that we follow them.
Okay, Matt, what are these rules?
Sarah said, rolling her eyes. Matt took a deep breath, his expression grim.
First rule, we can't be on the road after sunset. We need to make sure we're at the cabin by then, no matter what.
Lisa laughed, shaking her head.
What? You're scared of the dark?
It's not the dark, it's what comes out after dark.
What comes out after dark? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Matt didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved on to the next rule.
Second rule, once we're inside the cabin, we don't go outside until sunrise. No matter what we hear, no matter what happens, the doors stay locked and the windows stay shut.
Come on, man. You're freaking everyone out with this horror movie bullshit.
Dave said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, but Matt didn't smile.
I'm serious, Dave. If you don't follow the rules, you won't make it through the night.
The tension in the air was palpable, the joking atmosphere from earlier completely gone. Lisa shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I could see the unease in her eyes.
What's the last rule?
Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground.
The last rule is the most important. If you see anything that doesn't belong, don't acknowledge it. Don't talk to it, don't look at it, and for God's sake, don't invite it in.
Silence hung heavy in the air as we all absorbed his words. I could see the fear in Matt's eyes, a fear that made me want to turn around and head back home. But Lisa squeezed my hand, giving me a small, reassuring smile. When we all nodded, Matt went back to grab his last bag when Dave chimed in.
Oh man, Matt is laying it on thick with his cabin in the woods talk. $100 says he rigged up something that will try to scare us. I'm telling you right now, there is no way I will be the first to shit myself.
We all chuckled at that. I nodded, trying to push the unease out of my mind. We were overreacting, letting Matt's weirdness get to us. This was just a road trip, nothing more. But as we piled into the car and started the drive up the mountain, the sense of dread lingered in the back of my mind. The drive was uneventful at first. We spent the time talking, laughing, and listening to music, trying to shake off the tension from earlier. But as the sun began to set, the mood shifted again. The roads became narrower, winding through dense forest, the trees casting long, dark shadows across the pavement.
We should hurry, we don't want to be on the road after dark,
Matt said from the back seat, his voice tense. Dave shot me a look in the rearview mirror, clearly annoyed. But he didn't say anything, just pressed down on the gas, the car picking up speed as we raced against the setting sun. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, the sky a deep shade of purple. The cabin itself was a small, rustic structure, surrounded by trees on all sides. It looked old, abandoned, with a thick layer of dust on the windows and overgrown weeds choking the path to the front door.
Welcome to paradise.
Dave muttered, shaking his head as he parked the car. We unloaded our bags and made our way to the cabin, Matt leading the way. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the door.
Remember the rules. No one goes outside after dark, and keep the doors and windows locked,
he said quietly as we stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was just as dusty and run down as the outside. The furniture was old and covered in cobwebs, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But it was warm, and after the long drive, I was just happy to sit down and relax. We spent the evening drinking and playing cards, trying to ignore the creeping unease that had settled over us. Matt was jumpy, his eyes constantly darting to the windows, as if he was expecting something to burst through at any moment. But nothing happened. The night passed uneventfully, and by the time midnight rolled around, we were all more than a little drunk.
I gotta admit, I was getting the creeps a little bit earlier. I bet he will save a jump scare for later. If Matt's career doesn't work out, he should go into showbiz.
Dave said when Matt went to the restroom. I just smiled, thinking if we would have changed our minds, if we would have heard these rules a lot sooner than we did.
I'm going to bed. It's been a long day.
Sarah said, stifling a yawn. We all agreed, and one by one, we headed off to our rooms. I was exhausted, the alcohol and the tension of the day weighing heavily on me. I fell into bed and was asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. But my sleep was anything but peaceful. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping on the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound. It was light at first, almost like the tapping of a tree branch in the wind. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was trying to get in. I glanced over at Lisa, but she was sound asleep, completely oblivious to the noise. I didn't want to wake her. I didn't want to seem paranoid, like Matt. But the sound was getting harder to ignore. Fuck, I whispered to myself, sitting up in bed. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. The tapping continued, relentless, like nails being dragged across the glass. Hesitated, Matt's words from earlier echoing in my mind.
If you see anything that doesn't belong, don't acknowledge it. Don't talk to it. Don't look at it.
But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I had to know what was making that noise. Slowly, I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my ears. I crept across the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight, until I was standing in front of the window. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I stood there, holding my breath, staring at the curtains that covered the window. My hand trembled as I reached out, grabbing the edge of the curtain. I hesitated, fear gripping my chest, but I knew I was going to do it. Just to prove to myself nothing would be there, and that this childhood fear of things in the dark was just my imagination. With a quick motion, I pulled the curtain aside, and then I saw it. Standing just outside the window, staring directly at me, was a figure. Its face was pale, almost white, with sunken eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Its mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The skin on its face was tight, almost leathery, and it was completely hairless, like something that had been burned. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The creature didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, staring at me through the glass, its grin growing wider and wider. My breath caught in my throat and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the bed. The creature's eyes followed me, its gaze unblinking, its smile never faltering. And then it spoke.
"Let me in, please. Let me in."
It whispered, its voice a raspy, unnatural hiss. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I remembered Matt's warning. Don't acknowledge it. Don't talk to it. Don't look at it. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the creature, trying to forget the sound of its voice. But it was still there, still whispering.
Let me in, please. I'm so cold.
I backed away from the window, shaking, trying to ignore the desperate pleas of the thing outside. It scratched at the glass, its nails leaving long, thin marks on the surface.
Please, I just want to come in.
I reached the door, my hand fumbling for the lock, and bolted out of the room. I nearly tripped over my own feet as I raced down the hallway, the creature's voice still echoing in my ears. I found Matt in the living room, sitting in the dark, his face pale and drawn.
It's here, isn't it?
He said quietly, his eyes locking onto mine. I nodded, too terrified to speak. He stood up, his hand shaking as he grabbed a metal box from the mantel.
We have to seal the doors. We have to make sure it can't get in.
I didn't argue. I followed Matt as he went around the cabin, placing strange symbols made of salt and herbs on every door and window. He worked quickly, his movements frantic, his eyes darting around as if he expected the creature to burst in at any moment. When he was done, we sat in the living room, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fireplace. Lisa and the others had woken up by then, all of them looking as terrified as I felt.
What the hell is going on?
Dave demanded, his voice shaking. Matt didn't answer right away. He just stared into the fire, his face pale and sweaty.
It's something old. Something that's been in these woods for as long as anyone can remember. My family has always known about it. That's why we have the rules. But no one's ever seen it this close to the cabin before.
The room fell silent as we all absorbed his words. I could feel the tension in the air, the fear hanging over us like a thick, suffocating blanket.
What does it want?
Sarah asked, coming into the living room. Matt shook his head.
I don't know, but whatever it is, we can't let it in. We have to make it through the night.
The hours dragged on, the tension in the room growing thicker with every passing minute. We huddled together by the fire, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. Outside, the creature continued to scratch at the windows, its voice a constant pleading whisper.
Let me in, please. I'm so cold.
But we didn't move. We didn't speak. We didn't acknowledge it. I thought about waking Lisa up, but she's such a heavy sleeper and I felt she was safer just sleeping through this, not knowing what we now knew. If we followed the rules, we could leave as soon as the sun came up, but it was getting harder to ignore. The scratching at the windows grew more insistent, more frantic, as if the creature outside was growing desperate. The whispering, once soft and pleading, became a low, menacing hiss.
Let me in. Let me in.
It was then I heard Lisa scream. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to the room. There she was, pressing her back up against the headboard, looking toward the window. It was then I remembered I never shut the curtain when I left the room. Looking at the window now, I realized the creature was no longer there. I closed the curtains, got Lisa, and we all went back into the living room. Lisa clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. I could feel her trembling beside me, and I knew she was as terrified as I was. Dave and Sarah were huddled together on the couch, their faces pale and drawn. Matt was pacing back and forth, his hands shaking as he muttered under his breath.
We just have to make it until dawn.
He kept saying, as if repeating the words would make them true.
Just a few more hours.
But dawn felt like a lifetime away, and the creature outside wasn't giving up. The cabin was filled with the sounds of its relentless scratching, the windows rattling in their frames as if the thing outside was trying to force its way in. The whispers had turned into growls, deep and guttural, filled with anger and malice.
Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in.
I tried to keep my eyes on the fire, tried to focus on the warmth and the light, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind was racing, my thoughts spinning out of control. What if it found a way in? What if the symbols Matt had placed weren't enough to keep it out?
Let me in. Now. Now. Right now. Let me in.
The growl was louder now, coming from the front door. I heard the doorknob rattle, the wood creaking as if something heavy was pressing against it. Matt stopped pacing, his face draining of color.
It's at the door. It's trying to get in.
Lisa buried her face in my shoulder, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I wrapped my arm around her, trying to comfort her, but my own heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest.
We can't let it in.
Matt said, his voice rising in panic.
We can't.
The door burst open with a deafening crash, the wood splintering as the door flew across the room. Sarah screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that sent chills down my spine. Dave jumped to his feet, grabbing a fireplace poker. The silence that followed was just as deafening. We all stood there for a minute, looking at the gaping black hole. There was nothing there but darkness. We stayed that way, which seemed like forever. Then it stepped out of that inky blackness. The creature was inside. It was even more horrifying up close. The pale, leathery skin, the hollow, sunken eyes, the mouth stretched into that grotesque grin. It was like something out of a nightmare. It moved with unnatural speed, lunging toward us with a snarl, its claws outstretched. Dave swung the poker, but the creature was too fast. It ducked under the swing and slashed at him with its claws, ripping through his shirt and into the flesh beneath. Dave staggered back, blood pouring from the wounds on his chest.
Dave!
Sarah screamed, rushing to his side, but the creature was on her before she could reach him. It grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground with a strength that seemed impossible for its thin, emaciated frame. Sarah's eyes widened in shock and terror as the creature tightened its grip, its claws digging into her flesh. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gurgle.
Sarah, no!
Dave shouted, struggling to his feet, but he was too weak, too injured to do anything. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her back toward the kitchen. "We have to get out of here," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the sounds of the struggle. Matt was already moving, his eyes wild with fear.
This way! We can make a run for it!
He shouted, pointing toward the back door. But as we turned to flee, the creature let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound that was both a roar of triumph and a cry of fury. It tossed Sarah's lifeless body aside like a rag doll and charged at us, its eyes fixed on Matt.
Go! I'll hold it off!
No!
Lisa screamed, but there was no time to argue. The creature slammed into Matt, knocking him to the ground. He tried to fight it off, but it was too strong, its claws tearing into his flesh, its teeth sinking into his neck. Blood sprayed across the floor as Matt screamed in agony. "Matt!" I yelled, grabbing Lisa and pulling her toward the door. "We have to go! Now!" We burst through the back door and into the night, the cold air hitting us like a slap in the face. The forest was pitch black, the trees towering above us like walls blocking out the moonlight, but we couldn't stop. We couldn't look back. We ran, our feet pounding against the dirt path, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of Matt's screams echoed in the distance, but I forced myself to keep going, to focus on getting as far away from the cabin as possible. "Don't stop!" I shouted, glancing over my shoulder. "Keep running!" But Lisa was slowing down, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts.
I can't keep going.
She gasped, her legs shaking. "You have to!" I urged her, grabbing her hand and pulling her forward. "We're almost there." But as I said the words, I realized I had no idea where there was. We were lost in the woods, with no light, no direction, and no idea if we were even running the right way. And then, I heard it, the creature's growl, low and menacing, coming from the darkness behind us. "It's coming!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "We have to keep moving." But Lisa was too exhausted. She stumbled, her legs giving out, and collapsed to the ground.
I can't.
She whispered, tears streaming down her face. I dropped to my knees beside her, my heart breaking. "Lisa, please, you have to get up." But before I could do anything, the creature burst out of the darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I tried to shield Lisa with my body, but the creature was too fast. It slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I looked up, dazed, just in time to see the creature looming over Lisa, its claws poised to strike. No! I screamed, forcing myself to my feet. But it was too late. The creature slashed at Lisa, its claws slicing through her chest. Her scream was cut short as the blood poured from the wounds, staining the ground beneath her. The creature grinned, its eyes gleaming with twisted pleasure as it watched the life drain from her body. I snapped. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was pure rage. But I charged at the creature, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it with all my might. The branch connected with the creature's head, and it let out a howl of pain, stumbling back. "Get away from her!" I screamed, swinging the branch again and again, each blow fueled by a desperate fury. The creature snarled, its eyes narrowing in anger, but it didn't retreat. It lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air. I barely dodged the attack, the branch slipping from my hands as I stumbled back. I was unarmed, exhausted, and terrified. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't let this thing win. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature's head. It connected with a sickening crack, and the creature let out another scream, its claws clutching its head. This was my chance. I grabbed Lisa's limp body and hoisted her onto my shoulders, the weight almost too much to bear. But I couldn't leave her. I wouldn't leave her. I turned and ran, the creature's growls echoing behind me. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed on, stumbling through the darkness, my only thought to get away, to survive. The trees blurred around me as I ran, my mind a haze of fear and exhaustion. I didn't know how far I'd gone or how much time had passed, but eventually the growls faded, the creature's presence slipping away into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn just beginning to break through the trees. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, Lisa's body slipping from my shoulders. I lay there, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. We'd escaped the creature, but at what cost? I looked down at Lisa, her lifeless body covered in blood, her eyes staring blankly into the sky. My heart shattered, the reality of what had happened crashing down on me. I had survived, but I had lost everything. The sun rose, casting its warm light over the forest, but it brought no comfort. The rules. I broke the rules, and everyone was dead because of it. As I lay there, broken and defeated, I knew one thing for sure. Never, ever, break the rules.
Thank you for listening to the darker corners of storytelling. I hope you enjoyed this short horror. I know we'd all like to think if we were faced with similar situations, we would do things differently. I'd like to think I would. And yet most people just go with the path of least resistance, like our main character here. Think about a time you were with a group of friends and you weren't very comfortable with what was happening. Did you go along with what everyone else was doing, or did you listen to your gut? You never know what will happen when you turn that corner. Until we meet next time.